Everyone, I would like to now introduce Susan Sheppard, who will be speaking. And Susan is a writer and artist who resides in Parkersburg, West Virginia. She is the author of several books on paranormal subjects. Susan has appeared on TV shows and movies. She has been on the Mysteries at the Museum and in the film Eyes of the Mothman. Susan most recently has been the executive producer of the feature-length film White Zombie, which is a remake of the classic 1932 movie of the same title. Susan's topic today will be Dark Man at the Crossroads, Indrid Cold, and the Men in Black. Please welcome Susan Sheppard.
Hi, very happy to be here. I think this is like maybe my 12th year here at the festival. I was telling Joe that 2016 is going to be the 50th anniversary, of course, of the Mothman. And not only the Mothman, but also the sighting of Indrid Cold in Parkersburg that happened on November 2nd, 1966. Now, I'm connected to many of the stories for various reasons. I grew up near the Partridge sighting of the Mothman, which happened in Center Point, West Virginia. It's listed as Salem, West Virginia in John Keel's book, but it actually happened in Center Point, West Virginia, to a man by the name of Merle Partridge. And that story has to do with the red eyes in the barn and the missing dog Bandit. Now, believe it or not, I am old enough that I do remember all of these stories. I was a small child at the time, but I remember my sister coming home from school one day, and she talked about having heard Paula Partridge talking about the night before where her dad had encountered these red eyes in the barn. At that time, there wasn't even a name for the Mothman. And then on November 2nd, 1966, which it had preceded the Scarberry sighting and also the Partridge sighting of the Mothman, was the encounter with Indrid Cold, which happened 1 mile south of Parkersburg at the crossroads of I-77 and Route 47. I had an aunt that was living in Parkersburg at the time, and I remember visiting her and listening to the story about this man who was stopped along the road by a UFO. So those were exciting times in West Virginia, and I can remember being a small child and even thinking at that time how perfect it seemed. It was only a couple of days out of Halloween, and I can remember still eating my Halloween candy out of a paper bag, and that many years ago. There are fewer and fewer witnesses to the Mothman sightings. I'm also the one that donated the Indrid Cold tapes, or the Woodrow Derenberger tapes, to the Mothman Museum, and that's why I appeared on the show Mysteries at the Museum. I have a lot of stories to tell you today. I had interviewed Mr. Partridge a few years ago, and he had lots and lots more stories that happened after the red eyes in the barn when Bandit came up missing on November 15, 1966. Which happened about 2 hours after the Scarberry sighting here in Point Pleasant. Mr. Partridge told me after this initial encounter with these red eyes in the barn, he had many strange events happen to him. So I'm going to also talk about something a little bit different today that I haven't before, but I've thought about this for a long, long time, and that is that the encounter that Woodrow Derenberger had with Indrid Cold at I-77, at the crossroads of I-77 and Route 47, how much the story fit in with old universal stories about the crossroads. Now, this is going to sound maybe different to most of you because a lot of us don't know about the mythology behind the crossroads. But throughout the entire world, all over the world, in Africa, in India, in Europe, there are these stories about beings encountered at the crossroads, because it was believed that crossroads are a place where human laws do not apply, and anything can happen there. The crossroads are also thought to be doorways to other worlds and other realms. And it struck me that this dark man that Woody Derenberger encountered at the crossroads is very similar from ancient tales from the Middle Ages of dark men at the crossroads, even down in Mississippi in the 1920s. If I have music followers here, you've probably heard the story about Robert Johnson at the crossroads, being stopped at the crossroads by the man in black, or the devil, where he sold his soul to the devil, and of course his life became ruined after that. That's an old folklore tale as well. Now, the crossroads are places of great spiritual danger. They're considered to be a place betwixt and between. It's a place where supernatural creatures can pass through dimensions. This is believed in all over the world. It's believed in all countries. Even Native Americans believed in this. Now, they have always been believed to be haunted by spirits who take delight in leading travelers astray. Now, usually at these crossroads, there is a bargain that is made where the person's life is either changed or ruined in some way. And this, of course, was the case with Woodrow Derenberger. Now, if you get down to Mississippi, in hoodoo culture, the man in black at the crossroads is considered to be the devil. But he's not a Christian devil. He's actually a trickster spirit. He isn't really a biblical thing. But once you make your agreement with this dark man or this black man at the crossroads, for money, for fame, there's always some life change. Whenever this bargain is made, all does not end well. Well, I've thought about this for a number of years, and it struck me that in 1966, 1 mile south of Parkersburg, on November 2nd, 1966, as I said, a local man by the name of Woodrow Derenberger was stopped by a man in black at the crossroads who was not a malevolent fairy, which is believed in Europe. It was not a vampire. It was not a ghost. It was not a devil. This dark man at the crossroads was the alien Indrid Cold. Now let me tell you a story about Woodrow Derenberger. It was on November 2nd, 1966, that a local man, he lived in Mineral Wells, which was south of Parkersburg, by the name of Woodrow Derenberger, was driving home from his job as a sewing machine salesman in Marietta, Ohio. He was at the crossroads of I-77, Route 47, when suddenly, behind him, he thought there was a vehicle coming up behind him, and he believed it was a tractor-trailer truck at a very high rate of speed without its lights on. Now, Mr. Derenberger swerved to the side of the road, and much to his surprise, it wasn't a truck, it wasn't a vehicle, it was a spacecraft that rolled over Mr. Derenberger's panel truck, came down, hovered off the berm of the road about 9 to 10 inches. Mr. Derenberger described this craft as a dark charcoal gray. It had a glittery-like appearance in its headlights. It hovered there, 9-10 inches off the road. A man stepped out whom he described looked like any ordinary man on the street. There was nothing unusual about his appearance, except the man was dressed in black. It was about 7:25 in the evening, and it was misting a light rain. And as Mr. Derenberger sat in his panel truck and this man proceeded walking toward him, he was surprised to hear him say, "Do not be afraid. I mean you no harm. I only want to ask you a few questions. And that is when Mr. Derenberger became afraid, because as the man spoke to him, his lips did not move. The man came to the opposite side of the car. He peered in at Mr. Derenberger, and he said, "Roll down the window, I want to talk to you," which Mr. Derenberger did. Now this man he described as looking like any ordinary man on the street, was about 6 feet tall. He looked to be about 35 years of age. He had a tan-like complexion, dark hair slicked straight back, and he had a beaming smile throughout the whole conversation. He asked Mr. Derenberger, "What are you called?" He didn't say, "What's your name?" He said, "What are you called?" And Mr. Derenberger said, "Well, my name's Woody Derenberger." And the man then said, "Well, my name is Cold." Now, during this conversation, Indrid Cold pointed toward the lights of Parkersburg and said, "What do you call that?" And Mr. Derenberger said, "Why, that's Parkersburg. I call that a city." And Indrid Cold said to him, "Where I come from, we call it a gathering." Now he began to question Mr. Derenberger about Parkersburg. He said, "Do people live there? Do they work there?" And Mr. Derenberger said, "Well, yes, they live, they work." Now, throughout the conversation, Indrid Cold said to Mr. Derenberger, "Why are you so frightened? I mean you no harm. I only wish you happiness. Why are you so frightened?" Now, then Indrid Cold said to Woodrow Derenberger, he said, "Do you work?" And Mr. Derenberger said, "Yes." And Indrid Cold said, "What do you do?" And he then said, "I'm a sewing machine salesman," in which Indrid Cold answered, "I'm a searcher." Now, they kept up this conversation for several minutes, five minutes or so, which Mr. Derenberger said was all mental. Now, as he was questioned about this in later television interviews, he said that no words were uttered. It was all done through mental telepathy. And Indrid Cold said to Mr. Derenberger, he said, "Now, you can talk or you can speak. I can understand you either way." So he's more or less saying to Woodrow Derenberger, he's saying, "You don't even have to talk, I can understand what you're saying." And later in interviews, they said, "Well, did you speak or did you communicate through mental telepathy?" And Mr. Derenberger said, "Well, I don't really even remember whether I did or not." Now, Mr. Derenberger later said he was completely frozen throughout the whole conversation. And Aunt Cold kept saying, he said 4 or 5 times to him, "Don't be frightened. I mean you no harm. I only wish you happiness." Now, he also said during the interview, "We are no different. I am just as you are." Also throughout the whole conversation, Mr. Derenberger said Indrid Cold told him pointedly to please look at me. He said, "Look into my eyes and look at me." And he was very frightened to do this. And later he said, "I wished I have looked into his eyes longer, because I feel if I had looked into his eyes the way he looked into mine," he said, "I would have understood him in the way that he understood me." Now he said during this conversation, he felt like Indrid Cold was not really that interested in the questions that he was asking him. He said he felt that Indrid Cold was more or less more interested in keeping up a communication with Mr. Derenberger. Now, after this conversation went on, it only went on 5 minutes. I think, what have I talked 5 minutes now? It only went on about 5 minutes. And Indrid Cold said to Mr. Derenberger, he said, "Thank you for answering my questions, Mr. Derenberger. We will see you again." Now, Mr. Derenberger said the craft, which was about 40 feet across, he said during the conversation, it had gone up to about 45 feet in the air. And he said cars were passing under this UFO, seemingly not to notice it. And it was misting a light rain. It was very rainy that night. And he also said later that he never saw any lights in the craft until a hatch opened in the craft. That was the only time he saw any lights. He said that when Indrid Cold said to him, "We will see you again," the craft came back down. It once again hovered about 8 to 10 inches off the road. A hatch opened. A human arm extended, pulled Mr. Derenberger back up into the craft, where it immediately jetted up to about 45 feet in the air again. It made a fluttering sound, and then it shot away at a very high rate of speed. He got home about 10 till 8. Got home about 10 till 8 that night. He lived in a farmhouse at Mineral Wells. If you've seen the movie The Mothman Prophecies, Gordon Smallwood is based on the character Woodrow Derenberger. However, Mr. Derenberger never was a farmer. He was a sewing machine salesman. His wife noticed that his appearance, which she would later describe that he could not have been any whiter than if he had been lying in a coffin. She said, "What has happened to you?" He said, "Get me a glass of water and I'll tell you." He sat down. He told his wife the story about being stopped by a man dressed in dark clothing at the Crossroads, and the conversation that ensued, and also the fact of this dark charcoal gray UFO, and how frightened he had been. His wife went in and she called the West Virginia State Police. The next day, Woodrow Derenberger tried to go to work, which it was impossible. So they did a live television interview with Woodrow Derenberger the very next day, which was on November 3rd, 1966. And those tapes are now in the Mothman Museum. They're only old, reel-to-reel tapes. It's a very interesting interview to listen to. Throughout the interview, he was interviewed by Glenn Wilson, local reporter Glenn Wilson, the local media, other local media from the newspaper. He was interviewed also by the Wood County Airport, and officials from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base were on their way to interview him as well. And during the whole interview, they say to him, were you drinking? Have you ever had a nervous breakdown, Mr. Derenberger? What would you think if we told you such a story that we were stopped by a man in a UFO? And Mr. Derenberger said, "I would have thought you crazy, because up until this time, I wouldn't have believed in any such thing." Now, also during the interview, Glenn Wilson, the reporter Glenn Wilson, says to Woodrow Derenberger, he says, "Mr. Derenberger, if Indrid Cold was very pleasant throughout the entire conversation, and he had a smile, and he wished you happiness, why is it you still seem so frightened?" And Derenberger said to Glenn Wilson, "Because Cold said to me, 'We will see you again, and that is what I am afraid of.'" Now, after that, Woodrow Derenberger claimed to be visited not only by Indrid Cold, but also the Men in Black. He would come up missing at certain times. He would come up missing sometimes for 6 months and say that he was off with the aliens. And some of these children even claim that they remember visits from Indrid Cold to the farmhouse in Mineral Wells. Well, how did this story become included in the Mothman Prophecies book? John Keel was on his way, I believe, he was a freelance journalist, and he was on his way to Kentucky covering another story, and he stopped in Point Pleasant, and he found out that the story about the Mothman, the red-eyed Mothman, was far more interesting than any story in Kentucky. But when he was down here, he also heard about this story about Woodrow Derenberger, and he saw some similarities between not only I believe Indrid Cold was basically your man in black. I don't think he was anything else. And the question is, what are the men in black? I think in many ways, if you look at this story of the Mothman, the men in black, and Indrid Cold, they could almost be like a dark fairy tale from the Middle Ages being stopped by men dressed in black, because those stories do occur, throughout history. Now, he had a nervous breakdown after this. He got a divorce. He had to move away because the people in Parkersburg were making fun of him, and he became an object of ridicule. There was an area in Wood County, not far from Mineral Wells, called Bogle Ridge, where Woodrow Derenberger claimed that Indrid Cold would come down in a spacecraft, and he would go up to Bogle Ridge and meet Indrid Cold, and they would fly away, and he would become missing for weeks and sometimes months, as I said before. Finally, the family came under so much ridicule that they moved away to Cleveland. And the family did move back to Parkersburg in the late 1980s, and Mr. Derenberger, I think, died around 1996. He passed away, and he is buried at Mineral Wells, as a matter of fact. Is this a credible tale? I know that in some interviews, John Keel said he thought Woodrow Derenberger made it all up. I think there's a lot of things to this tale that adds to its credibility. One of them is it preceded the Mothman by 12 days. There were no Mothman sightings when Indrid Cold stopped Woodrow Derenberger at the crossroads of I-77 and Route 47. Hadn't happened yet. This was on November 2nd. So this was 12 days before the first Mothman sighting. There were other elements to the story as well that makes it credible, and that is Mr. Derenberger did not call the police, his wife did. She insisted upon calling the police. Also, another interesting thing that Indrid Cold said during the conversation, you may contact the authorities, and at the proper time this will be confirmed. He said all kinds of interesting things. He also said during the talk with Woodrow Derenberger, he also said, I come from a country less powerful than yours. He comes from a world capable of flight. Is it flight, or is it something moving between dimensions? That's a possibility as well. But after his encounter with Indrid Cold, Woodrow Derenberger's life fell apart, and it never came back together. Never did. There's still many people in Parkersburg that don't believe the story. But I think Mr. Derenberger would have had to have been a clairvoyant or something to know what was going to happen next. And also with the fact, when the men in black came to visit Woodrow Derenberger, he thought they were either, he was very terrified of the men in black as well. And he thought they were officials from the government, and he even thought once they were the mafia. He was scared of them. And they would come and they would ask him questions, and they would give him subtle threats, which is sort of the modus operandi of the men in black. And we also forget, to be honest with you, all of these sightings, we don't like to think about it now when we're having all this fun at the festival with the Mothman pancakes and the Mothman ice cream, and it has like I said, it has a fairy tale quality. It has a quality of fantasy to it, and it's at a distance from us, isn't it? But every single person that had any encounter with the men in black, and also Indrid Cold, with Mr. Derenberger, with Indrid Cold, despite his beaming smile, and also the Mothman, they always felt a sinister quality with all of these sightings and all of these creatures, whatever they were. Crossroads are a place of projections of energies. So, if you live in West Virginia, let's put it this way: if you live in Mississippi in the 1920s, and you are stopped, or you go and meet a dark man at the crossroads, and your name is Robert Johnson, and you make this bargain, and you interpret him as the devil, this man dressed in black at the crossroads, right? You're going to think that's the devil in the 1920s in the Mississippi Delta, if you are an African American person. If you are in West Virginia in 1966, and your name is Woodrow Derenberger, and you are stopped at the crossroads by a man in black, you're going to interpret that perhaps as an alien, right? So we interpret these things through the eyes of the culture that we view them. Don't you think so? In medieval Europe, it's going to be the devil. It's going to be a dark fairy. It's going to be a man dressed in black. That's going to be a vampire, right? You're going to interpret that as a vampire. Anyway, they're all considered to be sinister in some way. I hate to say it with the fun that we're having here, right? I also want to talk about another case that I'm familiar with is the Partridge sighting. And this is another case that I remember. And I'll tell you in a minute how I got the tapes to the museum. And later, if you want to ask me any questions, we can do that. Now, on November 15th, 1966, in a small farming community called Center Point in Doddridge County, West Virginia, my grandmother was once the postmistress of Center Point. There was about 50 people there in this community. About 10:30 at night, a man by the name of Merle Partridge, not Newell, Merle Partridge, John Keel must have misheard Mr. Partridge's name. His name was never Newell. Mr. Partridge was sitting with his young son, Roger, watching television when the TV set began to make a whining, grinding, like weird sort of sound. It was very loud. And the picture blanked out on the television set. As the picture blanked out on the television set, they could hear their 75-pound German Shepherd dog named Bandit begin to bark and bark and bark in a very atypical, unnerving kind of way. So they listened to this for a couple of minutes, and Mr. Partridge grabbed his flashlight and, along with Roger, went out looking for their dog. And they saw the dog about a football field away. About a football field away. And the dog was standing at the entrance of the barn, barking and barking and barking. It would not stop. There was quite a racket. So they get up to the barn, Mr. Partridge and Roger with his flashlight. And I'll tell you exactly what Merle Partridge told me. All right? Now, in John Keel's book, he describes the Mothman's eyes looking like bicycle reflectors, red bicycle reflectors. Mr. Partridge said that wasn't correct. He said to him, they look like red rotating electrical lights. So as he's looking at these two red rotating electrical lights, this form began to lumber up in the barn. This sort of dark form began to lumber up. A paralysis, he couldn't move, a paralysis swept over Mr. Partridge and his son. The dog snarled.